Welcome back, everyone. You know how much I love a good deep dive.
Yeah.
And, well, this one has me really excited. We're diving into the whole world of platform businesses.
Yeah.
You know, platforms are everywhere these days. And you sent over some excerpts from Platform Strategy. That's the Reillier book, right?
That's the one.
I got to say, I dove right in.
Yeah.
And it's a really fascinating look at how to design, launch,
Yeah.
and actually grow a business in
Yeah.
this whole platform era that we're in.
It's a good one.
It is a good one. But I think even more than that, it gets you thinking about how business models are changing in really fundamental ways.
Absolutely.
So before we get ahead of ourselves, let's break down the basics. What exactly is a platform business? We hear that term everywhere these days.
Right. Yeah. It's one of those buzzwords.
It is. It's a total buzzword.
Yeah.
But this book actually gives a really clear definition, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It cuts through the noise for sure. It boils it down to this. Platforms connect users and producers to transact,
Okay.
which sounds simple, but then when you start thinking about it, the applications are everywhere, really.
Totally. The examples that come to mind right away are like eBay, right?
Classic.
Connecting buyers and sellers, or Airbnb, linking travelers and hosts.
Exactly. Those are the classic examples. But what I liked is the book also highlights a ton of other examples that you might not think of immediately. Like, did you know Tinder is considered a platform?
Oh, interesting.
Or Kickstarter?
Huh.
It just shows how diverse that platform model can be.
That's a really good point. It's not just about online marketplaces, right?
Right.
It's social networks, crowdfunding. It's really a whole new way of thinking about how we connect and exchange value.
Absolutely. And what makes platforms so powerful and so different from traditional businesses is this little thing called network effects.
Right. The book calls that out as a game changer. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. Essentially, it means the platform becomes more valuable as more users come on board. And they illustrate this with a really striking visual. I think it's figure 4.1 in the book. It shows how this value doesn't just grow linearly, it explodes exponentially.
Okay, so it's not just adding 1 + 1. You're creating this upward spiral.
Exactly. More users attract more producers, which attracts even more users, and so on. It's incredibly powerful for growth. And I think the question for your listeners is, what would it mean for your business, for your industry, if you could tap into that kind of exponential growth?
That's a powerful question. And speaking of powerful things, the book uses this rocket model analogy to explain the stages of a platform's journey. And honestly, that really clicked for me because it highlights just how different this model is from traditional linear businesses.
Yeah. It's a great analogy. It's not just build it and they will come.
Yeah.
It's not about building a product and then just pushing it out to customers.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
much more dynamic.
It's a totally different way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And it all starts with attracting users, right?
Yeah.
But here's the kicker. You need to attract at least 2 distinct groups, sometimes more.
At least 2. Right. It's a delicate dance.
Yeah.
Take Uber, for example.
Okay.
They need both riders and drivers to succeed. If one side is missing, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like you're building an ecosystem from scratch.
Yeah.
So you've managed to attract both sides of your platform. You've got them in the same digital space. What's next?
So then it gets really interesting because it's not enough to just throw everyone together.
Right.
You need to think about matching, connecting, enabling transactions,
Mm.
but in a way that creates value for all sides.
And the book gives some really concrete examples of how platforms actually do this, right?
Tons of examples.
Okay.
They talk about how Amazon's algorithm, for example,
Okay.
doesn't just prioritize the cheapest product. They consider things like seller rating, shipping times, customer reviews, all to create the best possible match between buyers and sellers.
So they're really thinking holistically about it.
Absolutely. It's about building trust and optimizing for quality within the ecosystem.
So it's not even just about the transaction itself. It's about creating a seamless and trustworthy experience from start to finish.
Exactly.
Which, I mean, when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense.
Right. And that's, I think, where a traditional business mindset might fall short because platforms require that fundamental shift in thinking.
Okay.
It's about building a system where all the different parts work together seamlessly to create value for everyone involved.
I like that.
Yeah.
Building a system. So we've talked about network effects and this idea of creating an ecosystem. But I'm guessing it's not all smooth sailing, right? Getting a platform off the ground must come with its own set of challenges.
Oh, absolutely. The book actually calls that initial phase ignition, finding that elusive platform fit, like proving your concept actually works, that you can attract those two sides and get them to interact in a meaningful way.
Yeah, and I can imagine that's no easy feat, especially in the beginning when you're starting from scratch. You need a network to ignite those network effects.
Exactly. It's that classic chicken and egg problem, right?
Right.
And the book actually tells this really interesting story about Airbnb's early struggles with this.
Oh, okay.
They had this revolutionary idea, but investors weren't initially convinced. They just couldn't see a big enough market for people renting out their homes to strangers.
It was a pretty radical concept back then.
Right.
So what do they do?
Well, they got scrappy to make ends meet and prove that they had hustle. They actually started selling, get this, limited edition cereal during the 2008 election, Obama O's and Cat McCain's.
Wait, seriously? They were selling cereal?
They were selling cereal.
That's hilarious.
It just shows how important it is to be creative, adaptable, unbelievably persistent, especially in those early days.
Totally. I bet that experience really shaped them as a company. So let's say you've managed to find that initial platform fit. You've got some momentum going. How do you scale up?
Well, that's where you need to reach what the book calls escape velocity. It's about going from that promising idea to a sustainable business.
Okay.
And this is where those 6 growth dynamics that we touched on earlier become absolutely critical.
Right. You mentioned that. What were those? Again, I feel like this is key information for anyone who's trying to make it in the platform world these days.
Definitely. So the book breaks them down really clearly, talking about things like leveraging your existing users to attract new ones, designing for virality, finding ways to expand into new markets.
Right.
It's about understanding how to build that momentum and reach a critical mass where growth becomes self-sustaining.
Got it. So it's not just about growing. It's about growing smart. And the book uses Etsy as a good example of a platform that really nailed these dynamics, right?
Absolutely. They started as this niche marketplace for handmade goods, but they managed to grow into a mainstream success story.
Yeah.
And a big part of that was understanding those growth dynamics.
Okay.
Figuring out how to attract the right users. Not just anyone, but people who are passionate about handmade goods. Who would be those active members of the community?
Yeah, like they're building a movement. Not just building a customer base?
Exactly. It's about tapping into something deeper, creating a sense of belonging, a shared purpose.
Interesting. So you've launched, you've found your fit, you've scaled up, you're hitting the big leagues. What comes next?
Well, that's when you enter the maturity phase. And this is where things get really interesting, from a strategic perspective at least, because the focus really shifts from pure growth to defending your market position, optimizing for profitability, and constantly innovating to stay ahead of the competition.
Because even giants can stumble, right? The book actually mentions eBay's shift to buy it now as a bit of a cautionary tale.
Yes, great example, because it shows how even seemingly small changes can have this ripple effect on a platform.
Right.
And even though buy it now turned out to be a smart move, in the long run, it initially created a lot of anxiety among eBay's core users. The ones who loved the auction format.
They were worried it was going to change the whole dynamic of the platform.
Exactly. And that highlights, I think, a key challenge of maturity, managing change, but in a way that balances the needs of different user groups.
Right.
Platforms need to evolve to survive, obviously.
Yeah, sure.
But they also need to be mindful of what made them successful in the first place.
It's a delicate balance, for sure. And speaking of evolution, even Amazon, a company that just seems unstoppable, they're constantly evolving and adapting, right? It's not just about selling things directly anymore.
Right. And the book digs into this fascinating concept of the platform-powered ecosystem, and Amazon is a prime example. Because they've brilliantly blended all these different business models. Direct retail, third-party marketplaces, cloud computing with AWS, even entertainment with Prime Video.
Right.
And it all works together kind of seamlessly.
So it's not just about having all these different parts. It's how those parts connect and reinforce each other.
Exactly. It's like building a flywheel. So, Amazon can leverage its massive customer base to drive growth in new areas, like AWS, for example, and then use the profits from those ventures to further improve its core offerings, creating this powerful cycle of innovation and expansion, which makes them incredibly resilient and adaptable.
It's like they've created this unstoppable force.
Yeah.
But even unstoppable forces have to deal with things like, government regulations. And it seems like platforms are facing more and more scrutiny these days, would you say?
Oh, absolutely. The book actually calls this the Wild West of platform regulation, which I thought was kind of a perfect way to put it,
Yeah.
It's a brand new landscape, and nobody's quite sure what the rules are yet.
Yeah, it's a tough one. On the one hand, you don't want to stifle innovation.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you've got to protect consumers and workers and all of that. How does the book suggest navigating that?
Well, one thing they highlight is that regulation can sometimes be used strategically, even to stifle competition. They give that fascinating example of the New York City taxi medallions.
Oh, right. Those medallions were incredibly valuable because the city limited the number of taxis on the road.
Exactly. Created this huge barrier to entry for new companies.
Yeah.
And then Uber and Lyft came along, completely disrupted the game by leveraging technology and a different regulatory approach.
Totally. It just shows how quickly things can change. But those older systems, they don't just disappear overnight, do they?
Not at all. And that's why I think the book really stresses the importance of understanding that regulatory landscape and thinking about how it might impact your platform, whether you're building one now or just operating in a world that's increasingly driven by them.
Right, because we're all kind of touched by platforms in one way or another these days. So what's the takeaway then? For businesses that are trying to survive, or better yet, thrive in this platform-dominated world, is it every company for themselves?
You know, I actually really appreciated that the book offers some really practical advice on that.
Okay.
It kind of boils down to two main approaches: deny and delay, or embrace and extend.
Okay. Deny and delay. That sounds a little, I don't know, ostrich-like maybe.
Right, exactly. It's essentially trying to just ignore the platform wave, hoping it'll go away. Let's be real, that's rarely a winning strategy.
Probably not a good long-term plan.
Yeah.
So what about embrace and extend? That at least sounds a little bit more promising.
It does, doesn't it? It's about recognizing the power of platforms and then finding ways to integrate them into your existing business model.
Okay.
That might mean partnering with a platform. It might mean building your own, or even just, adopting some of the principles of platform thinking.
Like what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Creating those ecosystems.
Yeah.
Leveraging network effects, all of that.
Exactly. It's about adapting to this new reality and finding opportunities within it.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this whole platform world.
It's a huge topic.
It's massive. There's so much to unpack there. But before we wrap up, was there anything else in the book that really stood out to you?
There was one thing towards the end that kind of got me thinking. They touch on the future of work and how platforms are really reshaping the labor market. It's changing how people find jobs, how they work, how they even think about their careers at this point.
Big questions.
Absolutely. And it brings up all sorts of fascinating questions about, flexibility, automation, the gig economy, the list goes on and on.
Those are definitely things to ponder, for sure. Well, on that note, I want to say thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of platform businesses.
My pleasure.